Hello everyone. Today, this paper is called Program Design and the Development of Students' Global Perspective in Faculty-Led Short-Term Study Abroad. And this paper is all about program evaluation, which is a very popular topic in education. And specifically, this is about global perspective of students. So it is published in here, Journal of Studies in International Education, so international and comparative education. Students in this area might be interested in reading a paper like this. And what is interesting about this paper is it adopts a pretty quantitative method to measure students' global perspective in terms of the features of the program, which is a faculty-led short-term study abroad program, which is very kind of, there are many studies like this. And as the authors are like Watley et al. And the authors argue that they do make contributions in focusing on the features, the program characteristics features, including 6 subscales, which we will definitely be talking about later, but here they just listed it here. So their contribution, as they argue, is to specifically focusing on program features and its relationship on global perspectives, and by which the global perspective is measured with GPI, Global Perspective Inventory, which is a pretty popular, very frequently used measurement for global perspective. So that's pretty much about this whole paper. But if you want to dig deeper into this paper, let's go. So this first kind of introduction section is about setting up the significance, like why this study is important. And the authors justify those significant by listing all about the numbers, like how popular it is for this kind of short term study abroad program. And there is a need. Obviously, there are so many programs in reality. So there might be a need to explore what are the best practices of those kind of programs so that we can make better programs, and so that the students, for example, their global perspective can be improved with better kind of practices. So the aim of this study is to figure out what are those features of the program that can best facilitate students' development, specifically their global perspective development. So that's the introduction section. And the next kind of section is about what are those program features and characteristics that this article is focusing on. And here they listed again those kind of perspectives. However, they talked about it in terms of like literature. So it's kind of justifying themselves, like the program's characteristics are something that previous scholars have been exploring. So it is important because people are already doing studies about this. And according to those previous scholars, the core characteristic of a study abroad program includes the duration of the study abroad program, which means basically means the length of the program, the content, academic content, and instructional methods, whether it includes some reflection activity, students preparation and accommodations, so student support in this program. So those are the core characteristics of a program like this. So according to those previous scholars. And the authors continue with a specific discussion on each of those core characteristics, as you can see here. So that's basically their literature review, right? So maybe we can dig deeper in each of the sections. So for example, the first section about the sojourn duration, it specifically talks about the relationship, positive relationship or negative relationship of each of those features, program features on students' development. So they talk about this in this way because this is what they will study later in their own article. So the literature review serves the purpose, the correct purpose, because it justifies why they're focusing on those core characteristics and the specifics about the relationship between the features of the program and students' development, which is the global perspective development of students. So the author continues to discuss like those other program features until we can see the conceptual model. So this is the point that they finished the literature review. I said kind of because sometimes people also think conceptual model is also a kind of the literature review. So maybe we can just say this is the kind of conceptual way of review our literatures. After they reviewed the 6 different components of the program's core characteristic, they focus on, they then continues with this conceptual model, which they discussed a little bit about the outcomes they're focusing on. So the previous program features are kind of the factors, so which is like independent variable, right? So here, global perspective is kind of the dependent variable. Now, the outcome. So they discussed the outcomes definition first. So they cited this Fox and Engberg's definition of global perspective, and which GP means the communication, knowledge, attitude, and skills. So 3 things combined is the global perspective, and those kind of things that are important for intercultural communication, as well as developing a complex epistemology process and identities and interpersonal relationships. So those are the definitions. And with this definition, the authors come up with a way to justify why they're using GPI, which is the Global Perspective Inventory, in their study to measure outcome, because it's specifically about communication, epistemology process, and identities and students' interpersonal relationships with others. So they continue to introduce another important and also popular conceptual model, which is this DMIM, Developmental Model of Intercultural Maturity. And it's basically like 3 dimension for this DMIM model. And then the authors explained each of the dimension. What does it mean, right? So cognitive basically means students' understanding of cultural similarities and differences. Then the intrapersonal dimension is more focused on the students themselves. So how do they challenge their own views and beliefs? Vis-a-vis, we have the final dimension, the 3rd dimension, which is interpersonal dimension, and it's more about the kind of between people thing. So intrapersonal is like focusing on students themselves, or interpersonal is more about the interactions. So relationships, how do students engage in a meaningful and interdependent relationship with others? So those are the 3 dimensions. Again, if you want to have a higher level kind of message about this section, it's just about the author's justification about the outcomes that they're focusing on, which is the global perspective. And they introduced 2 conceptual models. The first is the definition itself, and the second is the dimensions of another model. And then they introduced their research question in terms, if you can observe already, maybe you already find out, like those research questions are basically around those 3 dimensions. So how do the program's characteristics influence these 3 dimensions of global perspectives? And the method they used to answer those research questions are quantitative, as I said at the beginning. And specifically, they collected students' response to GPI, Global Perspective Inventory, and those students are kind of 2,000 students answered that inventory, which is basically a survey. So they present table 1, which is like the about the students. So about the students' scores, GPI scores. So here are the 3 dimensions as we already introduced. And there are some subscales, so 6 subscales. And then each of the subscales has some like items, like number of the questions they asked in the GPI and the scores like the students get. So this is pretty much about kind of the overview of the scores, while later the authors analyze those scores using regression models and stuff. But here they kind of in this method section they have to introduce their measurement, right? So they have to discuss this GPI. So it is a kind of survey. It's a Likert type items using these 3 dimensions. And it's basically Likert type items is basically asking participants to rate those questions, those items on scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being strongly disagree to 5 being strongly agree. So this is basically discussing about the measurement, the inventory they used for their study. So as I said, they continue to discuss about the program characteristics, which is about like the factors, the independent variables. So those are the program characteristics. And the author revealed that they get this type of information by interviewing the faculty who led the short-term study abroad program. So this program characteristics, which is like the independent variable, is those kind of data is gained from interviewing the faculty, versus those kind of data is gained from students' response to the survey. So those scores are kind of the outcome and the dependent variable that the authors are focusing on. So those are kind of the method section. And then the students, the authors started to analyze those kind of data they gathered. So they have a pre and post test. So they asked the students not only after the student completed this study abroad program, but also before the program, so that they have this pre-test scores to integrate those pre-test scores into their model, so that it can account for those non-random variations in the outcomes. Because maybe a student is just talented and they scored very high at the beginning already, so it doesn't mean like the program is very effective, but we can only say maybe this student is something like very talented and something. So this is why they included this pre-test scores, so that we can kind of figure out kind of like control this effect of whatever individual characteristics that the students have. And then we can only we can kind of spotlight, put kind of a spotlight on the programs itself, its effects itself. So that's kind of why they have this pre-test scores. And they also have this clustered standard arrows here to account for the grouping of students. So maybe the effect is because of this kind of group. So the group itself has some effect on the GPI score instead of it's the impact of the program. So this cluster standard arrows stands for the impact of the groups. And later I'll show you a kind of table that they used to represent the different kind of data, like parameters, I mean. So you can see there, the clustered standard arrows are in that table. So the results from that, so they did the data analysis and they find something, right? So the results here are, so the pre-scores is higher than the midpoint value, so which is 17.5 for each of the items, which is basically mean each of the questions. However, it lower than the maximum value, so so it's not full score. Even it's higher than the average, the midpoint of the questions. So that's the pre-scores, while the post scores is higher than the pre-test scores across all items. So maybe it shows the program does have some impact. However, they also did a t-test to indicate the significance of the difference between post-test and pre-test. And the t-test is basically the p-value is very small. So so it seems that the difference is significant. So that's pretty much about kind of the very basic statistics. While they also did a kind of simple regression like OLS here. And in table 3, that's what I just mentioned about the kind of the table parameters. So regression models here. So let me let's kind of dive deeper and just focusing on this table. So as you can see, like what they already find is the pre-test and post-test. As you can see here is actually a correlation. I mean here, like the correlation of the items of. So it means like the pre-test score and the post-test scores are pretty much correlated. And the pretest score is what we said, like lower than the test score, the post-test score, and the difference is significant. So that's the correlation table, while the first several rows is about the independent variables here, which is the program's feature. So each of the program's feature, the duration of the program, the numbers of the students in the program, stuff like that. So those columns here, this kind of the second, third, and fourth column is about the outcomes. So the 3 dimensions of the outcomes. And also the subscales of each dimensions. So those are kind of the beta value here. So in a regression model, you feed the kind of the best parameter to predict a relationship between this factor and this outcome. So those are the beta value. So as you can see, for example, the number of students here is negatively related to each of these dimensions, which means more students in the program can have a negative impact on students, all those kind of global perspective dimensions here. And for example, if we can pick up maybe just this, so we can interpret this parameter as increase of 1 student can result in 0.018 score decrease in the student's cognitive knowing score. So that's what those data basically means. And you can apply the same kind of interpretation for all these parameters in this table, kind of the relationship between program's feature, which is the independent variable, and the outcome, the dependent variable, this 3 dimension of global perspectives. So as you can see here, they do listed the clustered standard errors in this parenthesis to just indicate the impact of the grouping. And that's about the results they find, which is pretty quantitative, while still very basic statistics. And they discussed the limitation of their study. So it is like just 2,000 students, and they say maybe it's not a pretty big data set. And they also admit that the results are from just one single institution and might not be generalizable to other institutions. And other limitations are discussed, including they don't have any information about the students' characteristics, which might be very important, which might be a very significant factor to account for students' GPI scores differences. So that's the discussion about the limitation, which is kind of a tradition for academia to have. You have to discuss some of the limitation of your study. While they also have some more discussions about the implication of the study. So as they find out, pretty much they focused on some of the counterintuitive results. For example, there is a negative association between living with a host family and a student's GPI score, because we usually a not counterintuitive way, a intuitive way of thinking about this is like if you're living with a host family, the GPI score might be very high. However, in this study, they find the opposite direction, a negative direction, and they provide some kind of explanation, kind of initial explanation. And they say maybe it's because this study is not long enough for them to have some interactions with the host family. And the same for the volunteer work, because they also find a counterintuitive relationship between students' volunteer work with their GPI scores. And the explanation again from based on the authors is about like not having enough time to engage because it's a short-term study abroad program. So to sum up, they provide implications that maybe we can provide some further research about why we have this counterintuitive phenomenon here, right? So for future research, and also for those other findings, for example, there are positive associations with GPI scores, which is like global perspective development, and those characteristics of program. For example, they're having a home institution faculty. They have all kinds of reflection activity during the program, and they offered some internships and in-country travel. So those are all positively relating to students' development in global perspective. So probably a implication for maybe program coordinator in this kind of study abroad short-term program is to have those kind of features because they are supporting students' development. So that's about the implications of this article. Again, this article is pretty much a program evaluation and using some basic quantitative skills in methods in education. And hopefully this is very like introduced for beginners levels. So hopefully this is a article that you find interesting because it's a very typical article in education about program evaluation. And hopefully you also enjoyed this video. Please subscribe if you do learn something from hearing from this. And because in the future, hopefully every day or at least every week, I will update my reading with some state of the art, hopefully education papers, including cross-cultural communication, kind of international comparative education, communication in general, kind of articles, journal papers. So thank you for listening.